Hi guys, I just had finished reading this patent from Valve, published about last year on June 2nd, and I don't think anyone's really talked about this all that much, so I'm going to run through this because it is very interesting. Valve in this patent talks a lot about using a brain interface or other biofeedback devices to determine how a player is feeling in a game. They use this stuff to determine how the game should play out, such as if a player is bored, maybe skipping a tutorial, or other stuff like that. They talk a lot about it being on a separate device that is standalone, running with its own process, RAM, and connect to LAN networks or wireless networks of the sort. They give some examples here, talking about maybe using heart rate to determine oxygen consumption in a game, or using the level of stress someone is feeling to make the game easier. They talk a lot about using this to develop player templates to determine how experienced you are in the game, and possibly apply that to other players. So whenever someone plays through a game, it determines that they're very experienced, applies that to a player template, and if someone else plays the game that are similar to them, the game would know that they're experienced and can give them a harder challenge off the bat, or to make them go through a tutorial faster or skip parts of it, things such like that. They also talk about using this to change controls or get rid of latency in actions. For example, to train a neural network to determine what a player's anticipated reaction is. So if they trained a neural network, it could determine what the player was going to do, predict that movement, and then confirm that the predicted movement would be right, to then use that to predict the movement before a player would do the movement, to remove latency from online games. Is some of the things they talk about here. They talk a lot about using this to change how a game is played, such as changing a tutorial to speed up or slow down. They give some specific examples, like changing amount of enemies, difficulty of a game, puzzles, speeds of tutorials, facial animations for your own player character, or other things like showing a beating heart for your own heart rate, or to determine if you're getting motion sick in a game. They use this to determine like weather. They talk about a scenario in which you would play with elves, and the elves would give you cookies if you're calm, but the elves wouldn't go near you if you weren't calm. Or, for example, if you're not calm, it would change the weather, make the sky go dark, it starts raining. Things like that in the game. They talk a lot about this running on its own separate hardware, but its possibility to connect to like hardware such as a desktop computer. So I believe this is something to do with VR headsets. This could just be used in playtesting, for example, to determine how players are feeling in a playtest. They could determine where the player's looking, how they feel when looking at that thing, to determine what needs to be changed in an environment, or what needs to be changed in an encounter with enemies to determine difficulty levels. So this could be something that isn't part of a consumer device, but is instead part of Valve's playtesting run through, where they determine how good a game is, not just by player feedback, but actually by biofeedback of the people playing their games. I think that could be really good for playtesting, and Valve is probably going to use that in the future, as they stated in this patent. They also talk a lot about changing a game in online play and sending biofeedback to a server to train a neural network to identify how a player is feeling. For example, determining if a player is anticipating something and then throwing them a curveball. Or, for example, they talked about spawning something behind the player where they know the player is not looking, or, for example, spawning something in the player vision where the player is not paying attention, so that things subtly change inside of the game. Or, for example, if a player is looking at something, unsure of what to do, and the player knows that they're unsure, giving them a tutorial or giving them a slight hint on what to do. Or if a player's lost and is unsure where to go, it would pop up a map for them. Or lots of different things like that. They talk about using this to also make a profile. I talked about the template earlier, but making a profile of how good you are at a game, so that the game can dynamically adjust, even if you've never played it before and it has no history of your play style. It would make a profile of other people who have played the game that are similar to you to determine how they want the game to run for you. They talk about using this to change the game in real time, such as oxygen consumption, or like oxygen consumption based on heart rate, or like weather effects, different things like that. Or they also talk about using this to change subsequent gameplays. That way you can replay a game, and if the game knows that you're expecting something to happen because you've seen it before or have experienced it before, it can change that so that the game doesn't feel stale. And they would use that to, I don't know, if you expect a character to say something, the character might say something different, or a puzzle might be different because the object is not where you expected it to be. Things like that. They talk a lot about using this in games. They also talk about using this for other things, such as, like, I don't know, store pages, or determining if a player wants to do something and replacing their controls. They talk about using this to, for example, even if a controller was not actually sending the input through, that they could use a predictive model to predict what you would have wanted to do with that controller, to use that as sort of like a keybind for the player. So, for example, if you think about wanting to use your map, or you're lost, the game would feel that you're lost, not knowing what to do, and give you the map without you having to do anything. They talk about using this in a lot of different scenarios. They talk about using this, for example, like I mentioned with the elves, but also like for a horror game, determine if people are scared or anything like that. They could possibly almost startle you by spawning things where you can't see them, or even places where you can see them, but you just didn't pay attention to that spot. They talk about using sensors that determine where you're looking and how much you're paying attention, which could affect that. They talk about a lot of different stuff in here, changing about how gameplay works, difficulty of enemies, how many enemies, how fast things go, time limits of games, and all sorts of things like that. They run through this with EEG signals, which are basically brainwave signals, and I believe that they plan to use this with the Galea project that they've been working with on the Valve Index. This could be, I would assume, since it's specified that the device would be standalone and can connect to other computers, that this would be the new Valve headset that they would be using this with, the one that's been kind of rumored about with other people. But yeah, they use this to determine eye movements, temperatures of your body, how much you're sweating, his heart rate, and a bunch of different things. For game testing, they plan, I think, to use this with eye tracking to determine, like, if someone looks at a tree and they don't like the tree, it's not something that they would usually report in a game report. If they're running through the level, it might be something that they kind of look over whenever they're writing a statement. But Valve would be able to determine that from the feedback in the actual loop, which I think would be able to let them tailor the experience a lot more. For example, if you had playtesters that weren't good at games, you could tailor an easier experience for people that would better suit them than people who are more experienced. And you could sort these people into these groups based on, like, resting heart rates, they said, whenever you launch up the game, or if the player, whenever they launch up the game, is feeling a certain way, they could determine how experienced they are with that kind of game or this specific game that they talk about. Yeah, they also talk about using this in a lot of different scenarios, and they give examples here that I believe are just purely examples because they don't want to give away what kind of thing they're doing. But Valve is known to want to make new games whenever they can push the medium forward, and I think this is their way of trying to push the medium forward in the future. The Project Galea, I believe, is actually pretty heavy underway on working on this for the hardware part of it. And I believe the new Valve headset would implement stuff like this, if not for consumers, at least for playtesting, so that Valve can run games through a playtest and get much better feedback from the people who playtest their games. I think it would be very beneficial for them, and I do believe that's probably what they're going to do, if not already doing it, because EEGs exist and eye trackers also exist, so they might actually already be doing something like this for game testing as we speak.